All right, everyone. So let's get started. It's 7 o'clock Eastern time. Thank you all who are on the East Coast and joining us just post dinner. I guess the West Coast, finishing up your work day. We invite you to a great session tonight. I'm so glad to present with Margie Jones-Carey and Dr. Jared Schurz, a conversation on social emotional learning and equity. This has absolutely been a recent topic that our districts and our schools are looking into, and building not only that healthy culture, right, that is supportive of all of our systems and structures and practices, but also I think you'll hear one of the items from Jared this evening is tuning into the area of self-care, wellness, and making sure that we have that mental health aspect very much in place, whether it's students, teachers, families. We want to be prepared as we go into what will be an incredible 21-22 academic year, and hopefully with all of our students back, having the foundational elements that will allow this to be a really spectacular 21-22. So I think this is going to be interesting in the way that we're presenting it. Notice it's a conversation, so a little bit different twist and maybe a little bit more informal, looking at some of the insights that these two excellent presenters and facilitators will bring to you. So with that, welcome again, and it's my pleasure to introduce Margie and Jared.
Thank you, Penny. We're delighted to be here. We'll just spend a couple of minutes kind of introducing you to us, and then we will be in a little bit of a conversation and dialogue. So we encourage you to join with us through the chat. If at some point you want us to open the lines because you really want to have that dialogue, we're certainly very open to that. But what we do promise is that you will leave today with some more information about social emotional learning and the concept of equity within social emotional learning, but also for classroom teachers and folks who work with our students K through 12, some strategies that you can even employ in the workplace, and you can also employ at the university level to help build that social emotional community that's really supportive of our youth today. So I'm going to ask my colleague Jared to just spend a couple minutes just kind of celebrate you, Jared. Tell us just a little bit about you.
Hi, Margie. It's nice to be in this conversation with you. I enjoy every conversation that you and I have. So I'm very much looking forward to this one because it combines a person and a process and a topic, all of which and whom I enjoy. I'm a vast connoisseur of learning. And for me, all learning is exciting. So every conversation has the opportunity for some kind of insight, growing awareness, and especially when it's unstructured, we have no format. We didn't talk about any of the questions or any of the ideas. We wanted to make this free flowing. But as an avid learner, I'm also a staunch supporter of educators. I believe that educators are the most important professionals on the planet. And it's my privilege to be able to support folks in the incredible work with the incredible challenges that you have. And we're fortunate enough to work with school districts all over the country, including some nice partnerships with some large organizations like the National Rural Education Association and the New Jersey Superintendents Association. So I'll look forward to sharing more. I enjoy talking about the topic more than I myself. How about you, Margie?
Thank you. I like to celebrate the work that we do. I'm not so sure. I'm always about celebrating, who I am or how I got here. But for folks that are joining us, you can see in front of you on the screen a little bit more. I always tell people either I wasn't very good at my job or I got bored easily because I managed to collect a whole lot of titles in my 34 plus years in education. Probably the one that I celebrate the most is a teacher and a parent. I loved being a school leader, that's true, but those two places taught me a whole lot about social and emotional growth and development. And they helped me refine who I am. And I tell people my most exciting experience was at the very end of my public education career when I worked with all emotionally disabled children. I was first their principal and then their assistant superintendent. And I have never learned more from anyone than I learned from those children. They're real and they get it. So I always celebrate that moment as kind of the culmination of what was a great experience in public education. So Penny kind of has said that well. We do know that we're faced with some challenges. We've always been faced with challenges in public education. We just haven't necessarily focused on them. But we know that the last year and a half has been a particularly challenging time and has created a whole lot of mental health concerns and some growth, both academically and socially, emotionally for our students. And so we know that as we begin a new school year, whether we've already begun it in places like I'm in Arizona, or will begin it shortly in places where Jared is, or Penny are in Florida, Rochester, New York, and in New Jersey, we're all facing the same challenges. We all need to engage in this conversation, and we all need to start to think differently about what do we know, what don't we know, how can we learn more about what we don't know and bring these things to our children and to our young people so that we can help them repair and refine their social and emotional place. It's been particularly challenging, I think, in some areas more than in others. But as Penny shared, if you weren't on with us, the CDC just came out with guidance about everyone wearing masks again in K through 12 education. So there's just a whole lot of things that happen when we wear masks. We can't see facial expressions, which we rely so heavily on. So I'm really excited to talk with Jared today a little bit more about some of those kinds of things. And in his experiences, how do we take that as educators, refine that information, and then make changes in our schools that will take hold? So Jared, let's talk a little bit. Share your thoughts.
You know, one of the challenges, and I would even love to see what people are thinking if they wanted to put their thoughts in the chat window. So it really is truly a conversation in this community that you've so graciously created, which is, are people looking to return to some normalcy, to restore what was, or are people looking to use this as an opportunity to evolve? Because they're very different mindsets. One is about stability and safety and grounding. The other is about creating something new and unknown, which is quite a challenge on top of the year that people had. So I'm hoping that what we've went through in this past 18 months and what we continue to go through leads to some kind of growth, some kind of evolution. And one of those areas, hopefully, is an area in how we take care of our community, how we support the personal growth and professional development of the adults and students. And that includes the parent community as well as the faculty. And I suspect too, Margie, you are also hoping on some level that this isn't just a response to a crisis, but this welcoming, this exploration of mental health and wellness might be more of a sustainable evolution, right, than just trying to calm after the storm.
So Jared, I'm seeing some things coming in that talk a little bit about the concept of celebrating, and then about taking kind of the best of what we learned during our last year or so in a very different model, refining that, kind of packaging that back up and bringing that into some of our best practices. We know teachers were really successful in many ways in supporting students and getting to know their students, even though they were squares like we are on a screen right now. But I think that teachers were frustrated too, because so many of the things that they usually use with students to get to know them, to build a community, to help them feel safe and supported, seem to be missing in this technological world.
Well, one of the challenges I think that we're all going to face is that we've had not only the sensory deprivation chamber that we've lived in for a long period of time, we've had an inundation of certain relationships which we're not used to having that much closeness, that much proximity with people, feeling so helpless and hopeless, being worried so much of the time, and lastly, being immersed in technology to the degree that we've shifted the balance, that brain-body balance, way to the side of, right, cognitive emphasis. And by doing all of that, what happens is that we reduce our capacity for distress, and we start to diminish the signals. Because in Western society, we basically talk about symptoms, right? Anxiety and depression are symptoms. And then when we talk about symptoms, we look for treatment. And when we look for treatment, we look for abatement of those symptoms. Well, in my world, we look at symptoms differently. We look at them as messages from the body. We look at them as our body's way of communicating with us something very specific, which is what needs are being threatened. And that could be a perceived or a real threat, Margie, because sometimes it's hard to distinguish. Is this actually putting me in jeopardy, or is it just my experience of that? And it doesn't matter so much to the person who's experiencing that, because if your needs are being threatened, whether it's safety, whether it's power, whether it's freedom, whether it's fulfillment, we go into this mode of self-protection. And when we're in self-protective mode, all of our energy is diverted into insulating ourselves. If anybody in the audience is old enough to remember the original Star Trek, please let me know in the chat window. Yes. But in the original Star Trek, and I won't try to imitate Scotty's accent, it was if we put all of our energy into shields, yep, we got at least one person out there, thank you, that we put our energy into shields, we didn't necessarily have energy for anything else. And as human beings, we do that. If we put our energy into self-protection in the short term, that works okay. The next generation, yes. But in the long term, putting our energy into self-protection is actually what potentiates mental health problems: anxiety, depression, trauma, relationship issues, burnout, which is actually a new diagnosis in the ICD-10. So the reason why I call it psychosocial emotional learning, I bet you were wondering if I would ever get to the slide,
Okay.
is because it's more than about a set of skills. It's well more than about how do we cope. Because to me, psychosocial emotional learning is all about how do we get our needs met? How do we become aware of those needs? How do we recognize when those needs are unmet? How do we express them? How do we negotiate for them? And how do we endure when we're not going to be able to get those needs met? How do we differentiate between needs and wants? There's so many aspects of it. So I include the psycho in there because it really is about looking at our self-protection and how to reduce that so that we can actually shift our focus towards being constructive in getting our needs met.
So Jared, kind of take us to that next place. Let's talk a little bit about probably the biggest struggle for educators that I heard in my work with schools, and I remember even experiencing at times as an educator, is the concept of student engagement or student empowerment. We seemed to almost have blank faces on the screen, if the faces were showing at all. And I think teachers were really frustrated with that for sure. And we really were struggling with why that is. And I think some of what you just shared may get to that. But, you know, as we think about the social emotional piece, what can we do to bring some of that back, to have them start to let some of that self-protection go and kind of rejoin us and engage in classroom situations? Yeah,
that's a really great question. Let me go down a rabbit hole first, and then hopefully I'll circle my way back around.
I'll play Alice, you play the rabbit.
You've been, I imagine, to those really large educational conferences where all the big companies are there with their big displays. I was at one years ago in Texas, and I don't recall exactly what it was. It might have been ISTE, the international, right? And what I noticed was they had all these signs around engagement. Choose our product, choose our service. It's the most engaging out of all the services. Well, if you remember, one of the executives from one of the companies, it might have been Google, printed a manifesto about what the company was really doing. And what they really did to all of us was they confused stimulation with engagement. They're not the same thing. Stimulation might make us interested. It might even make us reliant so that we have to use it. But if we use that their definition of engagement, we can include alcohol, cocaine, and opioids on the list. What engagement really is to me, it's about sustaining awareness and self-reflection and investment in a particular topic more and more on our own over time, so that we're less requiring of the stimulus to keep us involved. So when you asked earlier, which is such a smart question, and when you asked about how do we as adults engage, whether it's the students or the faculty, I believe there are some really fundamental things that we have to look at. One is we have to look at the agenda. As district leaders, so many of you out there, and please correct me if this doesn't fit for you, are struggling between the organizational needs versus the individual needs. On a day-to-day basis, you might have been changing your plan several times throughout the course of a day or a week based on the information that was coming in. It wasn't possible to engage in transformative kind of change where you're involved in active collaboration. It's all about the process, as opposed to incremental and transitional change, which is all about the outcome. And so that you really couldn't engage your folks in meaningful dialogue because they were looking to you as the leaders, as the people driving the ship. Well, then over a period of time, people get resentful of that because they're losing their volition. They're relying on you to help them feel involved and invested. So engagement to me is about how to know when to drive the ship, when to create policies and procedures and methods and rehearsal, versus when to get into the process, when to talk about people's experience, when to use conflict as an exploration of differences so that people feel like their voice is heard. And even if you don't go in the direction that they were particularly wanting, people are still feeling like their voice and their input is being considered. So engagement to me, especially with the faculty, starts out with really paying attention to that balance between organizational and individual needs. It pays attention to how much we're investing in the process of people feeling like their voice matters. And then ultimately creating a shared picture of what's going to happen moving forward. So for those of you who are looking at this as an opportunity to say, well, I'd like to see if we can create something new and wonderful from this awfulness that we've just been through. Well, this is an opportunity. And this is an opportunity to bring it in with an equity lens, bring it in with an attention to the personal and professional growth of your employees, doing it in a way which really integrates and coheses your faculty into a community. So engagement to me has a lot of layers to it, but it starts off with that balance. What do you think, Borgie?
I agree with you. I mean, I haven't thought about it exactly the way that you were describing it, the concept of stimulation, inside of engagement. I take it to the place of, I think if there's a mindset going on here too, for our young people who have grown up with screens and screen time, that when they go to screens, they don't have to be interactive. It's one way. And so I feel that we have an opportunity here to teach them that screen time can be interactive. It isn't passive, but they've learned that it's passive. So they can watch TikTok, they can go to YouTube. And so I think when we had to go virtual as schools, whether we liked it, we didn't like it, whatever we might be feeling, it became almost passive voice to our students. It was almost like empowerment to be passive. And so the opportunity to still continue to bring in some of our best practices around technology will force us to switch some mindsets too, about what engagement looks like and when we use screens and what does that mean to students and how do we get them to a new place. And so I kind of take from what you said, which is really the psychosocial pieces of it, which is really important for us to know, to it's a mindset. I think we have to flip their mindset too.
Well, the dilemma for me is that we can be forming this dependence on technology without even knowing it. If we're losing our capacity to hold feelings in abeyance, not react quickly, being able to delay our gratification, be able to endure higher levels of distress, that's really difficult to do when everything is so immediate and so available. Our expectation becomes that person didn't respond to me and it's already been a few minutes, or I can't get that piece of information. I now have to actually work on figuring this out or doing a deeper dive. We don't want students dependent on technology because we're not going to be able to see that. It's not nearly as evident as other kinds of addictions. But if we lose touch with our body because we're so skewed in the direction of using our brain for everything, which is natural to do, then we're going to be at risk of students not being able to cope with problems, wanting their parents and families to rescue them, wanting grades that maybe they didn't earn. And this is going to be a real challenge for educators. I see a comment came in. Did you make sense of what the person wrote? Because it seems like there's something really meaningful there, but I'm a male, so I'm not multitasking well by reading and talking.
Yeah, so the person just said that they recently heard a teacher say that as students came back to school, they were still on mute. And the teacher was looking for suggestions, ideas, and trying to get them to unmute in person. And we know that that's, so I think that is probably exacerbated by the technology situation, but we know that when we often speak to a class and ask for questions and sincerely ask for questions, it's like we're on mute. No one responds. And so there's the self-esteem pieces of that, the comfort within the community, all those pieces. So that's, I think, what the person, we kind of were talking about that a little bit as well. But let's talk a little bit about this concept of social, emotional, and equity, Jared, because you and I have spoken about this before, and I've done some work, and you have too, in the areas of equity, diversity, inclusion. And we know as a nation, this has certainly been in the forefront for the last 18 to 24 months. It's really been on our radar. It's been there longer for many folks, but to really be in front of our youngest people and on the news and things like that. So let's explore that topic a little bit. So I love this slide. I actually love the people, and I like some of the context that I see in the middle there of the dialogue, but I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit more about this intersection of the two.
There are two primary points of intersection that stand out to me, among others. One is that I earlier defined social emotional learning as the method by which we get our needs met. That's my simple explanation. And if you remember Maslow's hierarchy, which I'll just take a quick segue, which I've altered to create more of a diamond, because ultimately, if the foundation of psychological needs is safety and security, if you guys remember that from your psychology classes, you think about those children in communities or in neighborhoods or in families where safety and security, whether it's emotional or physical, is not a given. Maybe there's domestic violence, maybe there's food insecurity. They don't learn how to internalize that feeling and that need, and then they're not able to manufacture it themselves. Because ultimately, our job as human beings is to learn how to create and manufacture what we need so that we're less dependent on others or on the environment. Or we could develop an interdependency. So if in this time period, we've not learned how to get internalize that because we're not living in an environment that's necessarily safe, we've got to be mindful about that as adults. Because while every human being has the same set of needs, not everybody has their needs met to the same degree. So if you and I, Margie, come from different environments or different backgrounds in which one of us didn't get our needs met, that's going to show up differently in school. And that's going to show up through behavior. And it's going to show up in how we protect ourselves. Young children protect themselves through being disobedient, obsequious. They're going to do it through withdrawing, through being bothersome. That's their self-protective mechanism because they haven't learned how to get their needs met in a more constructive way. So for me, the intersection of equity and SEL is all about appreciating where that behavior comes from. What's the etiology of that particular behavior, so that we're not expecting everybody to behave and have the same attitude and the same way of relating because we're looking at them through the lens of what we grew up in. Is that clear? I know it's a bit of a complex topic.
It is. I mean, in all my work with schools and all my time working with children and with adults, we know what we know. We don't always know what we don't know. And so that's kind of similar to what you're saying. We each have our own lens and we see things through our own lens. And so when we are in situations where children are non-compliant, if we grew up with the expectation we were going to be compliant, and we don't know what to do with that as educators. And I think what you're doing is giving some kind of background and insight into why that might be the first response that we get. Is because a need isn't met. So how can, if you think about it from your chair, and so what can teachers start to begin to do, or educators begin to do to unpack that a little bit? How could they go about unpacking?
Yeah, that's really the starting point. And I was doing an administrative workshop today, part of an administrator retreat in South Jersey. And one of the administrators said that they addressed this with one of their teachers, and the teacher responded by saying, I treat all my kids the same. Why is there an issue? Well, we have to start by looking at the difference between equality and equity. Mm-hmm. We have to also appreciate that we all have our own implicit and explicit biases that we've addressed to some degree, but as much as we address it, it's still in us. It's baked into our DNA as much as anything else, because we grew up with it. These messages, these scripts are part of us. I would never say I'm not prejudiced, because while I don't intend to be, and I don't want to be, I absolutely have my own biases, right? If you have a brain, you have a bias. Really well said. So that it's not a question of do we have them? It's a question of what do we do with them? Mm-hmm. Are we willing to take them out and look at them? Are we in a safe community where the administrators are doing it for the educators, and the educators are doing it for the students, and the students are bringing it home to their families under the pressure of parents and families saying to the administrators, I don't want that in my school. Don't bring in critical race theory. Don't do this or that. And now the administrators have to decide how much of a fight or how they're going to navigate that. And oftentimes it can feel like a no-win situation. So these are the different layers by which the complexity of this decision is made. It's not just as simple as, listen, our country is struggling and we've got this polarization, and schools are the only place that we're going to be able to integrate our communities and learn how to explore differences with excitement, recognizing that differences are what create intimacy. The only way we're going to get to that place is if it happens in schools. But the only way schools are going to be able to do it is if there's a level of permission and there's a level of courage to have these kind of creative conversations. And I don't envy administrators, because it's not an easy position to be in.
Right. I mean, so one of our folks that's joining us, and thank you for that, Marnie, is that, vulnerability is uncomfortable, and it is. And my experience in working particularly with marginalized youth is you have to be aware of what you don't know, and then you have to build trust so you can get to the place where the students, the young people, will start to help you unpack that. I, as a leader, as a teacher, can't unpack that unless you're willing to unpack it with me. And so I think so often we forget how fragile those relationships are, how long they take to build, and how quickly they can be lost with our young folks. So Jared, think about that for a minute. Your experience obviously is a lot with building relationships. Talk with us a little bit more about how do we sustain those relationships? Because part of our role as educators is an academic piece. And I've had students say, I thought you liked me. Why did I get this grade?
Seeing ourselves clearly in relation to others is the absolute key. The way I thought about it recently was, if there are any science teachers in the audience, please hold your hands over your ears until I'm done, or just feel free to correct me. But we talk about flora and fauna as the two major components of the environment, of nature. But what we don't talk about is really the third prong, which is fungi. And fungi are the underground network of mitochondria that actually create communication channels between the flora and the fungi. Well, in schools, we talk about cognitive learning, and sometimes we talk about social learning, but emotional learning is really the conduit. It's the bridge between those two areas. And if we have educators who are self-reflective and able to see themselves clearly in relation to others. So for instance, I go into a group and one of the first things I say is, what do you see? Right? Do you see this old white guy? Do you see a privileged guy? Do you see a guy who's going to be all about authority or ego? What are you seeing in me? Because the more I have a sense of how people see me, the more able I am to understand how they're acting towards me, which is a great way for teachers to be able to intervene with their students, because a lot of times the attitudes and the behaviors of the students is either trying to replicate something in the student's life. It's putting the teacher in a position where they're going to experience the same thing the student has experienced, or it's a way of testing the person out to see their limits. So educators who are able to see themselves clearly in relation to others and iterate and make changes and have those kind of difficult conversations are going to be your best assets. But that can also be cultivated when you bring in consultants and you have your staff meetings, having those conversations where you look at your inequities and your frailties. You assume, right, that the aspects of who you are, your drives, your fears, your fantasies, your impulses, your memories and experiences, that people are going to reject you for that because they may be so off-putting. But what really happens in human nature is when we let down our protective mechanism, as we talked about earlier, and really embrace our dark side, right? That's when we're able to feel whole. That's when people let down their guard. That's when people start to respond in a more authentic way. And yes, as Marnie said, vulnerability is uncomfortable, but it's essential to deep contact in human beings. There was this great book I read years ago called Pigs Eat Wolves. It was only about that big. And it talked about the fairy tale or the fantasy. I don't know what the Three Little Pigs is. If there's an English teacher out there, please let me know if it was a fable or a fairy tale. That you had the first pig make the house build of straw, then sticks, and then stones. Well, that represents the protective mechanisms of a human being. And in life, as we get older, we become more sophisticated in those protective mechanisms. The dilemma is, what are we protecting ourselves from? The subtitle of the book was, After Pigs Eat Wolves, Going into Partnership with Our Dark Side. So what do you imagine the wolf represents? That's our dark side. That's the projection of all of those things about ourselves that we find off-putting and imagine everybody else will also. And if we project it onto the world, now the world is scary and hostile and unsafe, and that justifies my behavior. But if we incorporate and ingest the wolf, we own our dark side, now we've got nothing to hide. Now we're open, now we're transparent. And that's a way of living that wasn't possible during a crisis, but is something I strive to and encourage others to strive for as well.
I think that's very interesting, because it leads us to the conversation about getting to know our teachers as well as we get to know our students. And so vulnerability is actually a concept that has to begin at the top. And has to kind of be modeled from almost a top down. Otherwise, it'll be forced from a bottom up, is what I say. I hear lots of teachers when I talk with them about that, when I say, we have to have these harder conversations. We have to delve into things like equity, inclusion, bias. It becomes this very uncomfortable place with folks because they really don't want to share that information with us. But without sharing it, we can't move forward, because I don't know what I don't know about you. That's why I say to people that my last experience working with emotionally disabled children, many of them were from an urban situation, and they had all mastered the concept of getting kicked out of the community. They knew how to do that. They could do it hands down. And so getting to know them and letting them let you in was so important to a peaceful school. I used to say to the teachers, we have to get to know them. We have to understand them. We have to work with them where they are because, on any given day, they don't have to stay here and they don't have to have it be peaceful. So, children come to us in schools with kind of this background that we all have, that they're going to be compliant, that's just what they're supposed to be. And the majority of students are compliant, but that doesn't make them engaged. That doesn't make them stimulated. It doesn't do that. And so when they get to know us as adults, sometimes we're the first adults that have ever invested in them. And so they start to then unfold for us. And I can remember some of the stories that my students would tell me. They would come in, they were very tired, very groggy, and we would talk with them. And I can remember sitting with a young man, and he explained to me that he'd been arrested the night before. And so we had the conversation about what were you arrested for? He was arrested for holding a loaded gun. And I said, where did the gun come from? Well, it came from a friend. And I kind of had this conversation with him, sort of half joking, but not. Friends don't ask friends to hold loaded guns. That's just not what people do in those relationships. So his experience was so different from mine. And we had this great conversation. And he said, well, Miss, tell me about when you were a teenager. Where did you live and what was it like? I had to be willing to do that. And so very much as you said, Jared, I mean, I'm a white, suburban, middle class woman. Do you know what I mean? Like I am who I am. So I have to also project some vulnerability if I want my students and the people that I work with to do the same. And I loved your statement about bias, because we all have them. And I know that lots of times people try to nicely say, well, I'm colorblind, but we're not. And so I kind of have to help teachers rephrase that. Talk with us a little bit about your experience and like helping people rephrase some of those kinds of things. Like, how do you go about doing that because you don't want to shut them down because you want them to engage with you. But I also find that statement to be a shutting down statement. That's a way of shutting me down so we don't have to have the conversation. What's your experience like with that?
I have an advantage because I'm actually colorblind. So I tell people
we can let you do that. We can let you say it. I
do. If you only have to look at my clothes. The nice thing about Zoom is no one ever knew when I wasn't matching, which was just about every day.
Granimals. We could set you up with granimals.
But I really liked your story, and I really like the anecdote about the different definitions of loyalty and of friendship, because that was what I was trying to convey in a lot more words earlier, which is our way of getting our needs met, our way of being able to engage in that particular situation, a friend in a sort of a loyal, meaningful kind of experience was defined so very differently. You saw it as that was something an enemy perhaps would have asked of you. And here that was so foreign. So when we start to change our lens and when we start to get curious, I've been a family therapist and a couples therapist and a group therapist for a few decades before I started to do this kind of work exclusively. And when people would come into therapy, they would say to me often, what's my chances, of getting better, of resolving this? And I said, it's a complex question, but if you want a really simple, quick answer, I'll tell you curiosity. If you're curious about differences, if you're curious about how people experience you, like Marnie's saying, kids want you to get real. Well, kids want you to get real and people want you to get real, because that's when people don't have to protect themselves. That's when people can really take a really hard, honest look at life. And kids these days are much more willing to do that, I think, than we ever were in our generation. And giving people the opportunity to do that and becoming good facilitators of conversations, I'm expressing to administrators, is perhaps the most valuable role, the most important aspect of your job next year. And good facilitators are ones who can keep dialogues moving, keep it within bounds, provide some sense of navigation when people stray too far away, assimilate and help people see where they're overlapping and where they're divergent, help people find ground to come back to keep building upon their differences. So being a good facilitator, I would say, would be one of those top roles to promote the work of equity and the work of resilience, which, I see that you have that slide up on the screen, a great starting point. And that will all be about encouraging curiosity.
I like that idea. I mean, I think that that's helpful to us. I think that there's a piece of resiliency as well for educators. I watched and worked last year with so many schools. And there are people who are by nature resilient, and then there are people who are not. And those with that sense of resiliency seemed to come through last year exhausted by the end, but still hopeful. It was May and I was working with some teachers and they were still hopeful. They still had that hope that we're going to get through this. We're going to bring the students around. We're going to have them work with us. So what kinds of things would you say to teachers who are on your faculty? As a leader, what can you say that encourages a little more of that resiliency that keeps educators going? Because it's a long school year, and last year was a really long school year.
When people are working on evolving, fortifying, that it's important to know what the vulnerabilities, and that's using the vulnerabilities in a different context, what our risk factors are, as well as what are the sort of pro-social factors. And the risk factors are people who are not pliable. Greater rigidity generally leads to greater distress. People who don't navigate or adjust their expectations. People who are not receptive to feedback. Certainly those people who are not self-reflective, so they can't look at the etiology of what's creating the distress, because ailments like anxiety and depression have a large component of self-manufacturing. Mm-hmm. We can create these kind of problems if we create certain scripts, if we imbalance brain and body, mm-hmm. if we don't listen to the messages from our body, if we avoid conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So when we want to grow resilience, mm-hmm. then we want to be able to encourage people to have a community, a culture in which there's bi-directional feedback, so that people have an opportunity to express their displeasure. As an administrator, it's not easy when the parents and the faculty are both unhappy, but if they can't do it directly, we know they're going to resort to less constructive means. And it just mm-hmm. takes a couple of parents or adults in a community to hijack your agenda, to take all of your time and energy. So having open forums, opportunities to be able to address concerns, being really interested and concerned and understanding about their experience, being able to have them to understand how their feelings tie into needs, because a really important formula is that sensations tell us about feelings, feelings tell us about needs. So if I'm sitting here at 6 o'clock and I haven't had dinner and my stomach is empty and I'm hearing some grumbling, that sensation tells me I'm hungry. If I pay attention to that feeling lets me know my need for, food and drink has not been met. It works the same way with fun and excitement, with power and control, with all the different needs. And we often misinterpret. And then when we misinterpret the need, we take actions which are not commensurate with the need. Maybe we take a drink of alcohol. Maybe we isolate ourselves. And now we're not actually getting our needs met. We want an environment in schools where people can actively identify and express their unmet needs. When they can do that, and believe me, I've run organizations before, and when I first thought about that concept, I said, whoa, what are you kidding me? I don't want complaining going on the entire time. That's going to be this unchaotic event. And what it turned out was that it really became a cathartic, unifying kind of experience in the group. And it was really eye-opening for me as a pretty young therapist and an organizational leader. So that would be my starting point, which ties into the mission and vision and the policies and procedures. But I imagine that, Marjorie, you've had some experience in this area too. So I imagine you have some thoughts on this as well.
Well, yeah, I do. And I thank you for sharing that, because I do think we all need to hear that at times and remember what the core of the behavior that we're seeing is. that the behavior is not just the behavior for the sake of the behavior. It's because there's some need that's not met right now. I know that in the work that we're doing a lot with schools right now, we are focused on trying to find what worked, what went well, and then we get to what didn't go so well. And then we talk about what do we want to hold on to. And so we start with the positive, like what did we do that was good, that we didn't think we could do, that went well? What didn't go so well? And then what do we want to keep from those two columns? Because even if it didn't go well, doesn't mean we don't want to keep it. It just means we need to repair it somehow and take it to the next level. And so, I found that as a leader too, people want you to hear them. So you have to have a place and a space for people to be heard. So I used to say, if I want the teachers to be open to the students, I have to be open to the teachers. Somebody has to hear each person's need so that we can begin to work on that. And probably one of the most powerful lessons that I think I learned over time was, I hear what you say, but I have to unpack what you say to get at what you aren't saying, but probably is really what you're trying to tell me. So, because people are cautious and careful with their leader, because your leader is your boss. We always have to be aware, right, of who we're talking to. And so they come in and there's some masked conversation and you're trying to figure out what they're really trying to tell you is the issue. And so they're protecting themselves, they're protecting your feelings, or whatever they're doing, and you're trying to get to the messaging. And so I found myself just having to become a super, super good listener. Like, I have to really listen to what you're telling me, but listen to the tone of your voice, whether you're making eye contact or not, so that I can start to figure out what is it you need from me. You're saying you need this, but what is it you really need? And is it that you want to tell me something isn't okay, but you don't know how to do that? So whether I'm 3 or I'm 53, I don't always have the language to give you what it is I want to give you. And I think that's part of the process of the social emotional learning, and the equity piece is the language is different from different people. And you've got to figure out how to unpack that from where the person is to where you're trying to take them. We've known forever that students do well in one classroom and not in another. Like, that's not new information to us. And we know that's because some need is being met in the one classroom and that same need is not being met in another classroom. Now, the need may or may not be teacher-centric either. It can be social group-centric. So you have to differentiate those. But my experience was really just to really, really hear, unpack, and ask questions, so I can really get to where you want to take me.
One quick reaction to that, Margie, because I really loved how you described that. So psychosocial emotional leadership is about listening, as you said, and I imagine the people who are a part of this webinar are probably the people who are already doing that well. But let me give you another reason, sort of to build on what you were saying, is that oftentimes when people are expressing displeasure or dissatisfaction, they're not always sure the etiology, the deep underpinnings of why they're unhappy. A good listener, i.e. a therapist, which it traditionally is, helps people get to oftentimes the root. So you said what they're saying and what they're not saying, the implicit and the explicit message, it may be hidden to somebody. And an honest exchange with someone who's listening and reflecting so they can hear what they're saying oftentimes lets them recognize, oh, maybe that's not what I meant. Or maybe there was something else there that I didn't get to. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Sure. And one of the experiences I had did a lot of work with restorative practices with schools, and worked as a building principal in a place that used normative culture and then restorative practices. When you have truly arrived at being a restorative practices community is when your faculty can sit in a community talking circle and share. That's when you've really crossed that bridge and have a whole community that's inclusive, that people feel empowered in, and that they know that they can speak and be heard and still repair the relationship. And so that's a large piece of the social emotional, is when you build these relationships with people, They have to be comfortable enough that sometimes you kind of cross that little bit of a line, but you can come back because the community's solid enough that I can bring you back into the community can re-accept you, and we can go on from there. And that's kind of when I think about the work that I've done that was most powerful with schools, it was that kind of work. So whether you want to call it restorative practices or you call it restorative justice, whatever you call it, when you can build that community where the voice of young people becomes empowered, and then the voices of adults to adults mimic exactly what we say we want within our community is huge, because we say to students often, we want you to act this way, but we don't model that as adults. And so when students start to see that community take hold and they see the adults interacting, they're like, oh, I guess this really is how it is here.
There are two parts of personal growth that administrators want to consider for next year, which is there's healing from harm, which the masses now have that as an important goal. And there's understanding how to become more efficient and effective with getting what we need in the present, learning better skills and techniques and methods of meeting our needs. And both those two areas are going to be important, this next year.
I agree with you. And so up on the screen, we just kind of have some strategies for you to start to think about for our folks that joined us and are just kind of looking for that takeaway for what can I do tomorrow. So, there's things like a one word that defines where you're at. And you can do this in so many different ways. You can have a dial, students walk in and point to it. You can have a little chart, and I've seen it done well, where students kind of point to what kind of a day they're having. If you do circles, you can do check-ins in circles. You can have Post-it notes. You can just have students, as I said, point. But students can come in and tell you how they're feeling today with one word. And people often say, well, what do I do with that? Okay, well, first of all, if you're having a really bad day, I need to know that, because your reactions to me may not be the same as they normally would be, nor will your reactions to your peers be the same. And so while it's very vulnerable to do that, it also is very helpful and enlightening for a teacher to know that it's not a good day. And it's pretty good for the other students to know that too, because you're not going to react normally. So we think about that. But what we don't often do in schools is we don't ask our teachers to do this. If you want to get it so that it really becomes a piece of it, then if you would ask your teachers how is today, that might be an interesting way as well to open the school year. How do you feel? Are you spirited? Are you excited? Are you hurt? Are you hostile? Are you angry? Like what's the feeling that you have? Because Jared, as you and I have been talking about, feelings get to needs. It's not always perfectly correlated, as we've talked, but there is a piece of feeling that then can help us get to the need. I don't know what you think of something like this, but for us, it's been pretty successful.
I'm glad that you find something simple. Nothing I ever do is simple. Systems are so complex that I look for districts that are really willing to embrace that complexity and not look. I know that there also has to be a starting point. There has to be something tangible. Right. They're busy. There are a lot splitting their agenda. Right. But the districts that make a real commitment to the well-being of their faculty, it's going to take time and energy, and there's a lot of work there. So I'm glad you and I are both talking, because they need both. They need something simple to build on, but there also needs to be an investment in this kind of work.
For sure, and so this is just another one. We kind of embedded it in there, the welcoming routines and rituals. What we do know about children and teenagers is routines and rituals are extremely important to them because it's predictable. And our bodies and our minds like things that are predictable. And so when we start a routine, it's so important that we continue that routine. And I often say that sometimes why students don't like when there's substitute teachers in, because it interrupts the rituals and the routines and the relationships for sure. And so coming up with your own welcoming routines and rituals that are super helpful also set the brain and allow for this change of mindset as I go from one class to another class, from one teacher to another teacher. And that whole idea that you and I have both spoken about, which is the number 3 on this slide, is the resiliency piece. I have to stay resilient as the educator, while I want you as the student to be resilient too. I have to stay resilient as well. So Jared, you kind of led us into a little bit about, the hard work that's ahead in schools. And I know you and I and Penny, we've spoken for a while about, how do we measure so we kind of know where we're at, and how do we know where we want to go, right? And so much of our work that we do with schools is to improve things. And yet trying to figure out, like, did it get better? How do we know it got better? Because in education, we're driven by budgets. It's fiscal, it's financial. And so at the end of the day, if we spend money to do something, we also want to be able to show that it made a difference, that it had an impact, that it moved things forward. And we have these intuitive senses about us. I tell people it was a lot like it used to be about technology. People used to say, well, if we spend all this money on computers, how will we know school got better? Well, it's hard to isolate that. But when we come to social emotional and we come to some of the other factors that we deal with in schools, it's not so isolated. And so, some of the work that's been very successful for us, and I know Jared is something that you and I said, Penny, have talked about before, is the concept that we can measure a starting point and then an intervention cycle, whatever that intervention cycle might be, and then the ending point to take a look at, this is where we were, and this is what we need to work on. And I think, Jared, you probably have had the same experience we often do. You go into a school and they say they want this, but they really need this. And you start with where they tell you they want to be. But as you peel back the layers of this onion, you find out, oh boy, there's so much more in here that we didn't know. And so the concept of beginning with a survey of some sort and a kind of a cross-referencing and then an intervention and then a post-survey allows us to really measure that successful piece. Yes, of course, we want to celebrate us and our work. Yes, we do. But we really want to celebrate that whatever you're doing now is making the difference you were hoping it was going to make in your school. What's your thought on some of that kind of thing? How does that, resonate, do you think, for the work that you do for schools?
Yeah, because there are sometimes unintended outcomes or consequences. Sometimes there are gains that weren't predicted. We oftentimes get surprised that there's not a direct correlation between intervention and outcome. Mm-hmm. People and systems are too complex. But the more time we spend going back and forth between assessment and intervention, or assessment and prevention intervention, mm-hmm. the more we can start to identify and data gather what's working and what's not working, which we can then use that information to retool and then approach a school with a different kind of lens. So I think those are two pieces of work that, as a therapist, always go together, and as an organizational consultant, have to go together.
So this just gives people who are watching just a sense of some of the types of questions. Jared, I know you've seen some of these before because we've shared some of our work back and forth, and our desire to kind of continue to grow together a little bit. So what's nice about these types of questions is it gives us some insight. And so we can have them look at students, teachers, faculty, or the community at large. And I did some of these as a principal. They were brought into me, and I've, of course, done them as well now through PLC. But questions, if you look at like attitude and outlook and the diversity, equity, inclusion, they give us real insight into what our students think about their school, about their learning, about whether people really care for me, about how I can solve problems. And so I like to look at students of different backgrounds try to understand each other. That's a pretty powerful question coming from 14-year-olds. What do they see? What do they think? What does the community think? What does the faculty think? And when you take those three different levels of responses and you kind of cross-correlate them, you get an overarching sense of what we're doing pretty well and people seem to be comfortable at least with. And then what do we need to do to kind of move us forward? And we end up with these types of reports that kind of give us yellow, green, and red with, green is we're doing pretty well. That doesn't mean we ignore green. It just means we know that we're on a good track. Yellow means it could go either way. It may have been red before and now it's yellow, but if it was green before and now it's yellow, what did we lose? And then we get to the reds, these are our real focus points where we're really at risk, where we really have some struggles and some concerns. And so if you just look at this particular one, students of different backgrounds try to understand each other. 63% of the staff thought that they did, but only 48 and 49% of our families and our students did. So, we don't know what we don't know, and we have our own self-perception. The same is true when we survey. And so the ability to pick up metrics around social emotional health and growth are so important for schools as they try to figure out where are we going to go and what do we bring in. I worry so much as we head for the new year that we will overwhelm our teachers because we want to fix everything that was not right in the last school year. And we have to prioritize what we really want to work on as we go forward. So Jared, what's your thought on that prioritization? If you were to see something like this come in and you were a school leader or even the organizational consultant, what would pop right out to you of this list of questions? What would jump at you?
Well, certainly the more data we have about the difference between perception is critical. If different layers of the system are perceiving the same entity differently, that makes me really curious. And again, curiosity helps us start to understand what are we doing well and what needs to be improved upon. So it's very difficult to get this kind of information subjectively. It almost has to be done through surveys in order to get really valid quality results.
Yeah, because people won't tell you it directly. They just won't. They're not going to say it to you. They're going to give you a lot of times what they think you want them to say, but they won't give you the honesty that, this kind of data can produce for you. So as we're kind of winding down our time together, Jared and I would love to hear from you. If you have some questions for us or some comments for us, we would love to entertain those. If somebody wants to dialogue a little and you chat us and let us know that, we can open up the line so folks can talk. The old Johari's window. Yes, I remember the Johari's window well. What was the one that we used to do? True Colors. Jared, do you remember True Colors?
No, I was a Johari window fan though.
So True Colors is you do this survey and it comes up and you end up with a color. So when you work on a team, there's different colors. And then people post something on their door. So when you walk into their office, you know what color they are as a person, which gives you some insight into their personality and their decision-making process. It's pretty interesting. I did it in one organization that I worked in, and I was the associate superintendent for instruction for a BOCES in New York State. And so at that point, I had all the instructional folks and all the regional services folks, so folks doing statewide contracts, things like that. And I came out to be an orange. Now, an orange is a pretty free spirit person, not somebody who follows the rules, that kind of thing. I thought the staff was going to fall off their chair. I was like, well, listen, I answered honestly, like just because I play a role over here doesn't mean that's my natural inclination. So it's, it does that vulnerability thing. It does open that door. They just got the biggest kick out of that for the longest time, because when you sit in an organization at this other level, people just assume. They assume you're a green or a yellow. And I was like, oh, no, not by nature. I'm not compliant by nature. I just make myself be compliant. So it's a very insightful thing. Anybody have anything that they want to open up the lines and talk with us about before we kind of wrap up our time together today? I think we've gotten a lot of information. Jared, you've given us some real insight into probably some of the courses that we all took in undergrad and grad school, and then we lose track of for a while. At the core of why do children do what they do? And why do they respond the way that they respond? And my life experience as an educator has been very interesting. So I've had students, standing on trucks and back parking lots, taking off their clothes. So, there's some need that's not being met there, and then responding to that need. So when I work with schools and with teachers and even in classrooms with students, I'm always trying to figure out what makes you tick the way that you tick, what makes you do what you do the way that you do it. And then how do I help you from there? So Jared, closing thoughts?
I am just so appreciative of folks who already had a long work day and on a Thursday night are still spending time with their own growth. That just is, what makes you an unsung hero. So I hope that the folks who are participating and the folks who watch this in days to come continue to take good care of yourself and continue to invest in the well-being of your faculty and the families, because that pays dividends long-term.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing. For the folks that are with us, you will notice on this screen at the bottom, we do have an event code, the 0728_conversation. If you want to continue to talk with us some more about the work that we do, the work that Jared does, you can certainly reach out to us and use that event code to kind of have a free gratis discussion where we can talk about where you're at, where you'd like to go, and see what we can all do to work together to improve our community. I always say to folks, the students we have now are the students that will care for us someday when we're older. We need to invest now. They are our future caretakers, so they matter. They matter now, and they'll matter a lot to us in the future. So super important. Penny, anything that you want to close out with before we wrap up our time today? You're on mute, Penny.
Got it. Got
There you
it.
go.
So much. I just briefly, I love the way that you address both the areas of school culture, some of the logistical kinds of things where we can find our entry points in. So we're working on the right areas and measuring those performance benchmarks. And Jared, I think that you just nailed it with the wellness, understanding mental health, the triad of needs and feelings and wants, and how that all cascades into how we relate to our teachers, our families, students. It makes me think that this is a very complex area on one hand. On the other hand, handled well, and if we're willing to step into that zone of being vulnerable and having some authentic conversations, we will be able to accomplish in 21-22 more than we ever anticipated and get through that healing process. I think of the joyful outcome at the end of this next academic year and have students and staff, it actually gives me shivers, look back and say, wow, we were resilient, we stayed with it, we did it, we didn't give up, and look where we are now. So this was quite a learning experience for me this evening. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, and to the company for making this available, and to you, Margie, for a very enjoyable conversation.
It was a great evening. I enjoyed it, Jared. You take care. Goodbye,
Wonderful.
everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.